Today, we're going to discuss ancient Greek civilization. We already spoke about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans and how they were the first civilizations that appear in what today is Greece. The Mycenaeans were definitely Greek, ethnically and linguistically and culturally. The Minoans, there's still a big question mark about their origins. To this day, we don't know whether they were even Indo-European in terms of their origins, and that's because we don't know what language they spoke, and we have very little knowledge about their history prior to establishing themselves in Crete. Uh, on that previous lecture, we also discussed how around 1200 BC, there was this upheaval throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. It starts with the Sea Peoples. They seem to be appearing everywhere. Very important people in terms of how disruptive they became and how their effects were felt in many geographic areas. So, what today is Greece and Asia Minor, which is the area right in front of Greece, you see that in the map, modern day Turkey, that area was deeply affected during the um, Sea Peoples invasions, not directly by the Sea Peoples, but by the upheaval that was created in the wake of their attacks. It is almost as if the Sea Peoples opened the floodgates so that other groups would start to mobilize. And when I say they start to mobilize, means violent mobilization. Although there is some debate about how violent some of these groups were as they moved in. But there's plenty of evidence that these were very troublesome, very violent times, and obviously the great civilizations of that period collapsed or suffered tremendously. Egypt survived, but it had to uh, contract. They had to abandon their imperial ambitions. Hittite Empire disappeared, and of course the Minoans and the Mycenaeans came to an end. So between 1200 and 800 BC, we have that moment of upheaval that Greece is going to undergo. And if you look at this map, there are all of those little red um, red things on the map. Those signify that those cities were burned. When archaeologists looked into the layers that correspond to this period, virtually every single major urban center was destroyed. So that obviously attests to the destructiveness of these groups. Uh, these are called the Dark Ages for two reasons. One is that the established states collapsed, and a lot of cultural traits disappear. For example, linear A and linear B, which had been used for centuries, come to an end. Linear B was only deciphered in the 20th century. Linear A still, we're still trying to figure out that system of writing. So culturally, you can see that there is a collapse, states collapse, there is violence, cities are burned. They're also called the Dark Ages to a certain extent because we don't know much. I mean, we have some archaeological evidence. We know about legends that emerge later that give us a sense of what happened in those days, but very accurate historical information is missing. But this period is very important because it is formative. This is the period where Greek civilization finds its origins. And Greek civilization is extremely important because it is the foundation of our own Western civilization. Uh, Greece is the West. There's no West without the Greeks. All the great accomplishments of our civilization, from science to mathematics to political systems to art to architecture to the outlook that we have on life, all of those come from the Greeks. They are the fundamental stone in the edifice that is Western civilization, and that's why it is very important to study them. Of course, all civilizations contribute to history, but in our case, our mentality, our origins are intimately linked to the Greeks. So right here, what we see is the Proto-Greek area. We know that if you remember, the Indo-Europeans developed on the Pontic steppe. And after several hundreds of years, you start to see in that area the development of what some linguists call uh, early Proto-Greek. That is, that the first time that a language that is the ancestor of Greek begins to develop. Now, by the third millennium BC, that is between 3000 and 2000 BC, the Greeks or Proto-Greeks, proto means the people who are just before they can be called fully Greeks. So the Proto-Greek area is located uh, a little bit north of what classical Greek was. Today, that's part of the country of Greece, of course, but in ancient times, those were the fringes of Greece itself. And perhaps it occupies part of what today would be Albania. By the way, the Albanians, after the Basques, the Albanians are the oldest people. So they were all, the ancestors of the Albanians already existed there, but now we have an influx of these people who speak a different language that is already becoming Greek. Of course, this Proto-Greek eventually will develop in different Greek dialects, and that is how we divide the different groups of Greeks during classical history. The main linguistic groups. Some people want to use the term ethnic, but it doesn't really apply to these terms. But the main linguistic groups that originally existed in Greece are the Ionians, the Aeolians, and the Dorians. The Ionians and the Aeolians are usually connected to the people who later became the Mycenaeans. So the Mycenaeans are probably from the same branch as the Ionians and the Aeolians, and it is believed now that the Ionians and the Aeolians were already present in Mycenaean times, or even that they are the descendants of the Mycenaeans who somehow lost some sort of connection to that earlier culture. The last settlement or invasion is that of the Dorians. And the whole concept of the Dorian invasion still appears in textbooks, but there's a lot of debate about this because historians are not sure whether it was just a migration that was peaceful or maybe slightly violent, or whether it was a full-scale invasion and conquest. The Dorians settled mostly in the southern part of Greece. Some of them actually reached Crete. They spoke a different dialect, I'm sorry, of Greek. But by the way, all of these dialects are intelligible with each other. So if you speak the Ionian dialect, you can definitely understand and communicate with Dorians or Aeolians. And by the way, there are more than these three. Eventually, they break up into small, even more dialects. But the Dorians settled, and the Dorians are interesting because they claim, and this is a mythological claim, right? It's not a historical claim, but they claim that they are the descendants of Heracles, and that they're not coming in as new people, but they're returning. So they call themselves, this event, the invasion of the Dorians, is often referred as the return of the sons of Heracles. And there may be something about that, where these people who were at one point in southern Greece, they left and they came back, or was this just a legend to justify their presence there? We don't know. But basically, these are the three main groups that established themselves in what today is Greece, and at that time they called Hellas, because in there the name that they gave to themselves was Hellenes. The term Greece and Greek are Latin terms. Those are the terms that the Romans applied to the country and to the people of that country. The Greek name of the country is Hellas, and the name of these inhabitants of Hellas is Hellenes. So Hellenic culture is Greek culture. And of course, as I have mentioned before, pottery usually gives us a glimpse as to the different stages that a culture or civilization goes through. So this is from around between 1100 and 900 BC, right at the heart of the Dark Ages and the Dorian invasions. And this is known as proto-geometric pottery. It is, as you can see, it has some uh, red and black pigmentation with decorations that are, slightly geometric. Uh, it is not what you associate with Greece and in our imagination, but you already see elements of that. You can see the patterns, you can see the colors. This right here, these are samples of geometric pottery, and that comes from around 900 to 700 BC. So this is already after the Dark Ages. And I wanted to show you this one in particular, the one on the left, because you see those symbols? That's called the meandros. The meandros is those straight lines that then bend at 90-degree angles, and they appear throughout. They are decorative motifs in the pottery, in the architecture uh, of the Greeks. Very often you see this on the upper edges of buildings, meandros, and the name comes after a river in Asia Minor that goes like up and down, up and down, up and down. A meandering river. That's where the word comes from. So by the year 800, the Dark Ages are past, and this period is called the Archaic period. By the time that we have the Archaic period, we have established city states already. Uh, Most likely they were ruled by kings at first, but eventually monarchies disappear. And in this beautiful piece of pottery, we see two warriors sitting with their full panoply, with their full equipment, playing a game, a board game. When we think of the archaic era, we cannot conceive of this period without Homer. Homer is a poet who lived around 800 BC, and he composed the two the two fundamental texts of Western literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He didn't write them, he composed them orally, they're poetry. And according to one tradition, he was blind, so he would go from town to town, from city to city, from village to village, telling the tales of these great heroes who had lived during a fabled war when all the Greeks launched an attack on the city of Troy, which was located in Asia Minor. The stories that Homer is retelling are stories that were already in the consciousness of the Greeks, so many of them knew the stories, but it was the way of telling it, it was the plot that he created around a basic narrative that made these two works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, uh, two of the most important works of literature in our tradition. So the first one, the Iliad, is the story of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Uh, there's the story that uh, Paris, who was the son of the king of Troy, seduced and abducted Helen, the queen of Sparta, and took her to Troy. Of course, Helen's husband, Menelaus, is very angry, so he goes to his brother Agamemnon, another very powerful Greek ruler, and he asks his brother to help him bring back his wife. And Agamemnon, who is really interested in conquest and power, says, "Of course, my brother." And he brings together all the cities of Greece and he launches an invasion of the land of the Trojans. And for the next 10 years, he will fight against them. The Iliad is the story about what happens only in a couple of months of those 10 years. It's not even the beginning or the end, it's just this period that revolves around the conflict between Achilles, who is the hero of the Greeks, and Agamemnon, the leader of the expedition. and also, of course, brings up the Trojan hero Hector, who represents the values of loyalty and the good family man, the good father, etc. The Iliad is important for several reasons. It's as a work of literature, it reflects the values of the time of Homer. But there's a universal aspect of that because even though Achilles and Hector and Agamemnon and all of these Ajax, all of these people are greater than life. The conflicts that Homer is talking about are human conflicts, and today, 3,000 years after, almost 3,000 years after this was composed, we read the story and we are moved and we are uh, we sink into the plot and we feel with the heroes and we identify with the outlook on life of people who lived thousands of years ago, who were warriors, who live in a society that is so different, and yet we still find it so familiar. So the Iliad is about fate, it's about the gods, it's about honor, it's about power, it's about ambition and greed and loyalty and lust and every human virtue and every human uh, frailty. The Odyssey is the sequel, and it is an adventure story. It's an amazing story. Odysseus, or Ulysses, who is one of the Greeks who went to fight in Troy, wants to get back to his land of Ithaca and to his wife Penelope, who is waiting faithfully for him. These two works together are also important because remember that the Greeks are divided, they're fragmented, they don't have a country, they are independent city states. And yet, in these two works, they identify with the characters, but most importantly, they identify with the values and the culture that is reflected in these works. So these are the different cities or kingdoms, city states, kingdoms that existed in Homeric Greece. By the way, Homer is writing, not writing, composing orally these poems around 800 BC, but the stories are not about his times. The stories are about things that happened 200 or 300 years before, and that had and these stories had kept in the collective memory of the Greeks. By the way, the story of the Trojan horse, it is a story. It is a Greek story. It's a Greek legend that existed at that time, but it is not part of the Iliad. The Iliad actually only deals with a couple of months of the conflict and not with the whole war, and obviously not with the end. In the Iliad, there is a passage where the poet, the author, gives a list of the ships that will go on this epic expedition. And it gives the names of all the cities that have now become an alliance against the Trojans. And that's very important because if your city was named uh, as one of those cities in the Iliad, it gave your state, it gave your dynasty, it gave your city tremendous legitimacy among the Greeks. The Greeks, even though they are not united politically, they're connected historically to the past, and they see this event as the common bond that makes them Greeks, that makes them Hellenes. As I mentioned before, the during the Dark Ages, there was a collapse of culture, and this led to the disappearance of linear A and linear B. So the Greeks didn't have a system of writing. However, through their contact with the Phoenicians, they borrowed the Phoenician alphabet. Now, the Phoenician alphabet only has consonants, and that's very typical of Semitic languages, including Hebrew and Arabic. So the Greeks took this, adapted it, and then they added vowels. And voila, the Greek alphabet was developed. And right there, you see the capital letters. Then this came much later, the lowercase letters, and you see the equivalent in our Latin alphabet. The Romans developed their alphabet from the Greek alphabet, and those are the names of the letters: alpha, beta, the word alphabet, right? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and the last one, omega. That's when you say alpha and omega is the beginning and the end. Very important, because now with the Greek, with an alphabet, the Greeks can write. And my God, did they write? They produced an incredible culture. They wrote poetry, uh, they wrote history, philosophy, theater, everything that you can imagine they wrote about. They produced an amazing civilization, and they enriched the culture to the point that uh, a significant part of all the modern Indo-European languages spoken in Western Europe uh, use terms that have Greek or Latin origin. Can you imagine science without Greek terms? The first, according to tradition, and most scholars agree, the first author whose works were actually written and not just transmitted orally first was Hesiod. And Hesiod lived around 750 BC. He wrote several things, but one of the most important is the Theogony. Theogony is the story of the origins of the gods. The Greeks were Indo Europeans, and therefore their mythology, their gods, their religion was connected to the myths of other Indo European uh, groups. You can see parallels with the ancient gods of India, or the Iranians, or the gods of the Norse, the Nordic peoples. But these earlier myths became more complex, more elaborate, and there were several traditions. So Hesiod is going to write this work where the different stories about the origins of these gods are presented. And again, this is something that the Greeks have in common, even though they're separated politically. Religion and this tradition of myth brings them together. Now look at this. This is pottery from 600 to 400 BC. It's known as black figure pottery for obvious reasons. The figures are black, and there's a special way in which they decorate them. They put something called slip, which is kind of like a very watery type of clay, and that's how they draw figures. And then they bake it, and then they take out the slip, and then the figures become uh, black. And it's quite beautiful. And if you look at, there are two things right here. One on the left, warriors, war scenes. You have warriors fighting with these shields that, if you remember the Mycenaean shields, there were the eight shape shields. These are kind of almost like H shape. You see the fellow on the right, but then the other ones are round. So the technology of war is changing. They're still using spears, but you can see that they're also carrying swords, and obviously they have these helmets that protect their full head. The piece of pottery on the right has athletes. Athletic events were very important for the Greeks, and they were not sport events in the modern sense. They were usually religious festivals that celebrated the gods, but they eventually came to celebrate the accomplishments of these athletes. And the Greeks developed a profound admiration for the human body. And here we see some early um, samples of Greek sculpture. These are called the kouroi. A kouros is a young man, and the kouroi were very common during this period. They were inspired by Egyptian sculpture, and you can see that they're still very rigid. That there's something a bit unnatural about them, and it is a celebration of. These are not gods. These are not heroes. These are just young men in the flower of their youth in really, really good shape. You can see that That guy has a six pack right there, muscular. It's a celebration of the beauty of the human body. And here you have the Korai, the female equivalent, and the differences are obvious, right? Because the Korai are dressed, whereas the Kuroi are naked. Women had a very submissive position in Greek society. And by the way, if you look, the one on the left is the original one. The one on the right is a reproduction, but that's how they looked originally. These statues, we imagine some of these statues as made in alabaster or white marble, but a lot of them were actually painted. Uh, Greece was colorful. It was not all white marble as you see in the movies. But again, very telling that the women appear covered, whereas the men don't. We'll talk more about later when we discuss the condition of women in specific Greek city states. And so during the Archaic period, the first polis are established. Polis is the Greek term for city state. Like in ancient Sumeria, a city state is a city with a surrounding territory that operates as an independent state, has their own laws, own government, own economy, own army. On the map, you see the red areas. Those are the areas where city states developed a very well organized state. Whereas the purple areas are areas that were still kind of tribal, where they were all Greek, by the way, but the purple areas were more like chiefdoms organized around tribal affiliations, tribal alliances. Eventually, of course, city states also developed in that area. And to the right, you see this. Of course, this is not real. This is just an artistic conception of what an ideal city state would look like. And if you look at that, have a city with temples. There's a theater. There's a place for sporting events. It has up in the hill an acropolis, which means the upper city where usually you have temples where festivals are celebrated. And then the city is surrounded by walls, and outside the walls you have fields, and the fields extend way into the countryside. And in this case, there's also a port. Uh, Very important because the Greeks were also great navigators. Around 776 BC, well, not around, on 776 BC, I should say, the first Olympic Games took place. These were religious festivals, and they were held in the city of Olympia, and therefore the term Olympic Games. And athletes from all the Greek cities would come together. If there was a war, the war would be suspended during the duration of the games. And at those games, in celebration of the gods, they would hold these sporting events, wrestling, races, throwing javelin, throwing the disc. These athletes representing, they were the embodiment of the Greek ideal of beauty, the Greek ideal of competition, the Greek ideal of honor. And those who won those events were celebrated. Poems were written about them. In the case of Athens, if you won the games in your particular event, you could have free meals for life for the rest. I mean, anywhere you go, you can have a free meal, which is not a bad deal. The Olympic Games are very important because in a society, in a culture where there are literally hundreds of polis, literally hundreds of city states by this time, events like this are the ones that bring people together, at least for a few days. Events like this are the ones that define the culture. And these are so important that usually the Greeks use the Olympic Games to date things. So if someone asks you, by the way, Olympic Games took place every 4 years. So if someone asks you, when were you born? You would say, Oh, I was born on the year of the 20th Olympic Games. So, 20 times 4, 80. Okay. Or I was born 2 years after the 23rd Olympic Games. And you do your math. It becomes a point of reference for the Greeks. And only Greeks could participate. Actually, this is interesting. There were cities in the north that, or I wouldn't even say cities, but chiefdoms sometimes, and sometimes kingdoms, that were ethnically Greek, but they were not invited to the Olympic Games because they were not Greek enough. So it was a matter of honor and of Greekness to be part of this. And according to one account, the country of Macedonia, which was a kingdom to the north of Greece and was a Hellenized kingdom, they wanted to be part of that, but they were not considered Greek by the Greeks. The Greeks actually thought that they were hillbillies, and they made fun of them. So the king of Macedonia actually bribed a committee to have uh, to declare his country worthy of participating in the Olympic Games. So very important in terms of developing a Greek identity, a Hellenic identity. And of course, when we talk about the Greeks, we have to talk about maritime exploration. We already spoke about the Phoenicians and how they were probably the greatest uh, mariners of ancient times. Well, the Greeks were up there also, not too far behind the Phoenicians. Right here, you see one of the primitive ships. This is a depiction, a piece of pottery. This is the other one on the right is a modern reconstruction of what it would look like. Using these vessels, the Greeks extended through the Greek islands, through Asia Minor, into the Black Sea, and beyond. The Greeks were not only farmers, but they were fishermen and they were merchants. They traded all over the Mediterranean and even beyond. We have accounts of Greek mariners, of Greek sailors who went all the way up to what today would be Britain. And there's even an account of someone who went to what they call Ultima Thule. The Romans actually call it Ultima Thule, which was supposed to be like the edge of the known world. And some people think that it may have been either the Faroe Islands or even Iceland. So we don't know how far these Greek sailors went, but we know that they explored the Mediterranean, they explore the Atlantic, and perhaps even the Baltic Sea. And they wrote accounts about that. So the maritime accomplishments of the Greeks are important. The thing about the Greeks is that they are so they are overachievers in every aspect of civilization that sometimes we tend to oversee that. But this is crucial. It is crucial to understand that the Greeks were a warrior culture, but also a sailing culture. Those two elements are extremely, extremely important. So around 750 BC, the Greeks begin a process that we call colonization. Now, when we think of colonization, we think of Spain conquering Mexico or Peru, or France conquering Canada, or some island in the Caribbean, or the British colonizing North America. Well, Greek colonization is different. It's a different pattern. And this is the way it works. It seems that around 750 BC, population was growing, it was exploding really in Greece. And if you're a city state, you have two options. One is you go to war with your enemy so you can acquire more land for your people. That's perhaps not the best option because it's war is dangerous. Plus, if you go against one of your neighbors, maybe the other neighbors think that you are the aggressor, that you're a danger, so they will all come together against you. So that's not really an option. You don't for There's one exception, and we'll talk about them later, but most of these Greeks basically realized that they had to keep um, within their borders. So, what is the only option if you have young people with no land? Well, you sell them somewhere else. You send them out to a place that you already know, that you have already scouted, usually a place where you have already developed some sort of commercial relations with the locals. So, right here, you see that the Greeks begin to extend after the Aegean around the coast of Asia Minor, what today is modern Turkey. The island of Cyprus eventually becomes Hellenized. Then the edges of the Black Sea. You see the Black Sea on the right and to the upper right. That's modern day Russia and Turkey and Ukraine and all of those places. So you go up and you can see the Crimea, which is that peninsula in the Black Sea. North Africa, Libya, even in Egypt, they settled. And then, of course, Italy. Italy was known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, because it had been thoroughly settled by the Greeks. And then, as you go west, the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, the southern coast of France, and Spain. That is the Greek world. And what happens is that you provide a group of young couples and perhaps a couple of older couples as leaders with supplies, and you send them there. And in those places, they build a city. Now, the new city, the colony, is obviously going to have close connections to the metropolis, which means mother city. But the metropolis is not the power that controls that new city. Every new city is independent. So it's not an empire. It is not a colony in the early modern sense from the British or the Spanish or the Portuguese. No, it's not that type of colony. It is really a settlement uh, that develops there. And it has an incredible effect. And you can see that especially in places like Cyprus, southern Italy, and Sicily. The local people realize that there are advantages to deal with these Greeks, to their commercial connections. There's something attractive about their culture. And obviously, there will be intermarriage. Those colonists will intermarry with the local people, and within the couple of generations, everyone is Greek there. They are Greek culturally. They have adopted the Greek language, the Greek religion, the Greek traditions, the Greek alphabet, Greek institutions, Greek architecture, Greek way of dressing, Greek way of fighting. So Greek colonization spreads Hellenic culture throughout the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And this brings us to the concept of Hellas. Hellas is the Greek name for their country, Greece. So if you are from Hellas, you are a Hellene. If you're from Greece, you're a Greek. But it's more than that, because you see that as the Greeks expand from 750 to 550 BC, as they begin to colonize the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the concept of Hellas expands, and it comes to mean more than just a country or a an ethnic identity, as we call it today, or a nationality, if you wish. The concept of Hellas goes beyond geography. It becomes a cultural concept, which means that you speak Greek, you worship Greek gods, you dress like a Greek, you eat like a Greek, you fight like a Greek, you build cities that look similar. Cities whose buildings represent what is important to you in terms of civic life, in terms of ritual life, in terms of economic life. And what that means is that if you are born, let's say, in the Greek city of Corinth, which is in Hellas itself, and you travel to Sinope, which is on the Black Sea, you will find people that you would be familiar with because they would speak your language. They would worship your gods. There would be temples to the same gods that you worship. You would be familiar with the food, with the dress, with the social values, with the maybe with the political system. Uh, and then you travel to Sicily and you will find the same. And then you would travel to Neapolis, the city of Naples, and you would also find those things. And you realize that even though there is no single state called Hellas, there's no single state called Greece, there's no such thing as a Greek empire, for example, or even a Greek kingdom, you share some cultural and ethical values with them. And that is the concept of being a Hellene. That is the concept of Hellenic civilization. And the Greeks, the Hellenes, then divide the world into two camps. There are Greeks, and then there's everyone else. And they call everyone who's not a Greek a barbarian. Now, every great civilization has a term for people that they consider inferior. The Egyptians use horrible terms for the Libyans and the Nubians, and actually, when you look at some of the depictions of Egyptian kings vanquishing Libyans or Nubians, they look almost beastly. The ancient Sumerians, looked at the Akkadians as lesser human beings, the nomads from the desert. The ancient Chinese looked at the people from the steppes, people from what today would be Mongolia, as barbarians. The ancient Aztecs had a term called Chichimec. Chichimecs were the savages that lived north of what today is central Mexico. Why? Because they were not as developed as they were. And even today, in Mexico, if you call someone Chichimeca, it's an insult, saying like you're a low class person. The meaning has uh, changed a little, but it has different dimensions, but still it's something that is derogatory. Now, you could understand why a Chinese person would feel superior to someone who lives in a yurt on the steppes of Mongolia, right? Or you can excuse why an Aztec who lives in this amazing city of Tenochtitlan would look at a more primitive farmer or nomad from northern Mexico as inferior. But the thing about the Greeks is that they call everyone a barbarian. Whether you are a Scythian who lives on the Pontic steppe and who, I don't know, herds sheep and lives in a tent, or you are a scholar who lives in Babylon, or a literate priest who lives in Egypt, it is all the same to them. They are all barbarians. Now, according to ancient Greek historians, and we don't know whether this is true or not, but they said that the term barbarian or barbaros comes from bar, which then is the sound that a dog makes when it barks. So the explanation here is that when they heard someone speak a foreign language, they say, "Oh my God, that sounds like bar. He sounds like a dog." It is quite an insulting thing, right? So whether they heard an Egyptian, a Babylonian, or a Persian, or a Scythian, they said they're all the same. They sound like a dog to me. And it sounds like a horrible thing, right? To think that everyone else is inferior. But we have to understand where the Greeks, uh, the origins of this notion. The Greeks, by the way, at that time, they had not accomplished much. I mean, their cities, if you were born in Babylon and you were to visit a Greek city, you would laugh. I mean, you know, you would want to be there for a long time. During the time that this concept developed, the Greeks had not yet produced, great philosophical works. This is before Plato and Socrates. This is before Herodotus and Thucydides, the great, pioneers of history. This is before they produced tragedy and comedy or built the Parthenon. So, what are they so proud about? What makes them feel so superior to the rest of humanity? And there are three basic things that the Greeks thought were important. One is prowess in war, that is, being good in battle. At their core, they were a warrior society, so victory on the battlefield is essential, and they were good. Number two, freedom from foreign domination. There's the old saying that if you put two Greeks in a room, you will have three opinions. The Greeks loved their independence. They loved to be different, incredibly individualistic. And for that reason, when you look at Greece in ancient times, at one point there were more than 1,000 city-states. Just take, for example, the tiny island of Lesbos. There were three city-states, three polis within this tiny island. Why? Because the people of this side didn't want the people in the middle to tell them what to do. Independence, extremely important. And number three, they want to belong, they want to be part of something that is greater than themselves as individuals, part of a community. And that's what the polis represents. When they looked at The Persians, when they look at the Egyptians, when they looked at everyone else, they said, these people are not true men. Why? Because they're not free. We are free. We are not subjects to a king. We are citizens of a polis. You see, the polis is not just the cities, not only the land and the buildings. The polis is the institutions, and most important, the polis is the body of citizens who make up that polis. And that's why the Greeks thought that they were better than the rest, because freedom was the most valuable virtue that they had. Uh, the ability to dictate your destiny, not just as individual, but as a collective, as a community. And it is not such a horrible concept after all, because if you look at the Greek world, most of the Greeks were outside Greece were not ethnically Greek. What happened is that as the Greeks built colonies, they intermarried with the local people, and eventually these people became Hellenized. So the Greeks in Spain are really, you know, descendants of Spanish people who I call them Spanish at this point because just for lack of a better term, but they're descendants of Celtiberians who learned Greek and adopted Greek customs. The Greeks of the Crimea, what today is southern Russia, they were the descendants probably of Scythians who became Hellenized. The people of Cyprus, the Cypriots, the people who lived there were their own ethnicity, their own culture. They learned Greek, they started to act like Greeks, they adopted Greek values, and they became Greek. So being a barbarian doesn't have to be a terminal state. You can actually become civilized if you learn Greek, if you embrace Greek values. So while the notion of Greek and barbarian is kind of putting people aside, separating people, on the other hand, the redeeming value of this concept is that if you integrate, if you embrace the culture and you integrate into the worldview of the Greeks, then you become one of them. You become a Hellene. And of course, the military of development of Greece is extremely important. The concept of military discipline that is still with us today is born there. Now, right here on the left, you see actually that's geometric pottery, and you see several figures, and you see one figure on the right that is actually a warrior holding a shield. And that shield is kind of an evolution of the eighth shield. Now you look to the right, this is actually from, that's a black figure pottery. And you see warriors still with the almost eight-shaped shield, except the one on the left that has a fully round shield, which represents a new development. That round shield is called the hoplon. And eventually, those who carry hoplons are called hoplites. And that will be a revolution in warfare. So right here, we see two examples of hoplites, and that's their panoply. Panoply is their equipment. On the right, you see a traditional hoplite, and there are some pieces of equipment that are essential. First, the hoplon, the big round shield made of bronze, wood and bronze. It's pretty heavy. Uh, you have armor to protect your chest and sometimes the back too. But metal is very expensive, so sometimes you only have a metal protection in the front and you have leather straps in the back. You need a helmet to protect your head and your face. You see that it has this guards that protect your chin. I'm sorry, your cheeks and your nose. If you then look, you actually have to also wear shin guards. And those are very important because they're called greaves. Shin guards are very important because they protect you from someone slashing you or cutting your legs down below. Weapons, you have a spear. It's about 8 feet long. It's a spear on one side and it's a pike on the other. The part there is the spear is made of iron. The pike is made of bronze, which is denser and heavier because you use that to finish someone off who is on the floor. So as you walk past by them, you just finish them off. and a sword. On the right, you see slightly different hoplite. Uh, I like the one on the right because you can see how the shield is made with layers. So it has bronze, wood, and leather, and that's a hoplite. You have the greaves, the shin guards, a helmet, in this case, a fancy one with plumes. Again, the main weapon is the spear, with a sword that you wear on the side. You could have different types of helmets, but in this case, you have a Corinthian helmet, which is you wear it up, and then when you go into battle, you lower it. And as you can see, it covers your face fully, so you can only have your eyes. Uh, you have vision and a space in the middle that enables you to breathe, and two little holes on the side so that you can hear. Very important battle. The armor, the protection that this fellow is wearing is actually better than the other one. The metal one is fancy, but it's not as good. This one is actually called the linothorax, which is actually made with layers of linen glued together. And what happens is that if you get hit by an arrow, the linen, the way that it's structured, will absorb the energy of the arrow, and the arrow will pierce just the tip of the thing, and will not penetrate it. So very clever and very good. So that's a hoplite. The hoplite is an infantryman, and hoplites were not professional warriors. Hoplites were not mercenaries. They were farmers. If you own a certain amount of land, you had to be part of the army in the city states, and that made you a citizen. And because these city states were poor, you had to buy your own equipment. So the whole panoply that you see here, the soldier had to pay for it. Can you imagine? That's like you enlist in the Marines, and they want you to buy your own tank, right? This was extremely expensive, by the way. Can you imagine the number of man hours involved in making a helmet or a linothorax or all of these things? So you had to have at least a certain amount of land and wealth, so that you could afford these things. And it's not a choice; you have to. If you are in a certain economic class, you have to participate in the local militia, and you train and you fight. And this is going to be significant because it is really the first army of citizen soldiers. Now, how good are these fellows? Well, one on one, they're good, they're okay. What makes them special is the following: when they fight as a single unit, as a phalanx. And here on your left, you see the formation. Actually, it was much larger than that, but this just to illustrate how it is. It is usually about 8 ranks deep, but it can be quite long. And the idea is that only like ranks number 1, 2, and 3 are doing the fighting. The people in the back are basically pushing, and it is grueling. It is one of the most violent and bloodiest forms of fighting. It's when you listen to, well, not listen, when you read accounts, you will hear that the smell of battle is the smell of, of blood, sweat, urine, and excrement. These soldiers were terrified as they went into fight, and sometimes they would just, they would urinate or defecate on themselves, but nonetheless, they did the job because they were part of a unit that had a lot of cohesiveness. These people knew each other, they trained together, and most importantly, they were citizens. They were not subjects of some king, they were citizens of the state protecting their freedom. And right here on the right, you see also other examples of hoplites. And also interesting because in the back you have this other guy. There's the guy with a little hat. He's a Thracian um, peltast. Peltasts were actually auxiliary troops that were usually hired from the outside. So in this case, that guy in the back with a little hat, he would throw javelins. And then there's the other fellow on the left who with a hat and just like a little bag. He was a slinger. I'm sorry, who used a slingshot. Those guys would come to the front, would throw the. It's not a rock. Usually, it's a piece of bronze that can go through a helmet. They would shoot their missiles and then move to the back, and then the phalanx would come forward. They would fight against each other, almost like an appointment. They would say on such and such day we will meet at a certain point. The hoplite would have food for 3 days, uh, one for the march, one for the day of the battle, and one when he would come back. And they would position themselves, and sometimes they would fight, and people would get wounded. Sometimes a few of them would get killed, and then they would separate and they would negotiate. Sometimes they would not even fight. Um, and that means that they didn't know how good they were. Of course, when we discuss the Persians, we, we now know how good they were. When the Athenians, with 6,500 men, confronted an army of 14,000 Persians, the Persians lost 6,000 men and the Athenians 192. That Battle of Marathon is amazing. It's the first of many in the history when Western armies with far inferior numbers defeat much larger non-Western armies. And that's something that it's consistent throughout history. That concept of military discipline is born with the Greeks too. So let's not forget that even though the Greeks produced philosophy and theater and poetry and all of those great intellectual accomplishments, at the core, they were a warrior society. And that defines a lot of their values. And next time we'll talk about the most important of the city states in Greece, the Athenians and the Spartans, Athens and Sparta.